The stars above were cold and endless, but the great hall of the alien city glowed with warm light. Miran, the human envoy, stood at the center of the chamber surrounded by towering figures whose skin shimmered like stone polished by rivers. This was the first formal meeting between humans and the people of Vera, and every movement mattered. He could feel the eyes of both his fellow humans and the aliens on him, waiting to see if he would succeed or fail. The Varans were larger than humans, with heavy frames built for the high gravity of their world. Their leader, a woman named Zira, stepped forward to greet Miran. She was tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry armor like it was nothing. She wore ceremonial bands of silver across her arms and chest. Her voice rumbled like distant thunder when she welcomed the visitors from Earth. Miran bowed politely, trying to show respect. On Earth, this gesture was simple. On Vera, it was not. As he bent down, the translators flickered, unsure of how to interpret the gesture. The aliens gasped, some leaning back as if he had done something shocking. Zira, standing close, reacted instinctively. She stepped forward, her foot slipping slightly on the polished stone floor. The heavy gravity pulled her off balance, and for a moment, the great warrior of her people stumbled. Miran reached out quickly to steady her, but before he could touch her, Zira caught herself with a low growl. A strange warmth spread across her face, a change of color that looked very much like a blush. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something the humans could not read. Then she muttered words in her own tongue, words that made the translator device struggle. The translation came out in a rough voice, "I cannot walk straight after what you did." The humans blinked, confused. The aliens gasped louder. Miran froze, unsure if he had caused a great insult or a great honor. He wanted to explain that he had meant nothing strange, but the weight of so many eyes on him kept his words trapped in his throat. Around them, whispers spread through the alien audience. Some of the younger warriors grinned, others whispered to each other with sparks of amusement. Miran's fellow humans shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or to panic. The elder of the Varans finally spoke, his voice deep and commanding. "The human envoy has made the guardian stumble. Such a thing has meaning in our culture." Miran's heart raced. He had read as much as possible about Varan traditions, but there was no mention of this. He could not tell if this was good or bad. He glanced at Zira, who stood tall again, her arms crossed over her chest. Her expression was unreadable, though the faint blush remained. The elder continued, "On our world, to make a guardian falter is a sign of boldness. Some say it is a challenge. Others say it is a declaration of intent. It must not be ignored." Miran's stomach tightened. He had not come here to start challenges. He had not come to make declarations he did not understand. He had simply wanted to bow, to show peace and respect. Yet the hall now trembled with tension, and the humans behind him looked at him with wide eyes, waiting for him to act. Zira finally broke the silence. "If the human dares to make me stumble, then he must face the trial. That is our way." Her words were simple, but her tone carried strength. She was not angry. She did not seem insulted. Yet there was pride in her voice, and the weight of tradition pressed down like the gravity of her world. The humans whispered nervously. Miran took a deep breath. He knew he could not refuse. To back down now would insult their culture and perhaps break the chance of alliance. He raised his head and stood straight, his heart pounding in his chest. "I did not mean disrespect," he said carefully, letting the translator carry his words. "But if a trial is the way to show respect, then I will accept it." A murmur ran through the hall. Some aliens looked impressed. Others looked doubtful. The elder nodded slowly, his heavy face thoughtful. Zira studied him with sharp eyes, as if measuring him already. Then she gave a short nod. So be it. Tomorrow at first light, the trial will begin. Miran's fellow humans shifted in shock. They had come here for diplomacy, not for contests. Yet the decision was made, and all eyes returned to him. The hall was heavy with silence, but inside Miran's chest, a spark of determination began to grow. He had not expected this, but humanity had always survived the unexpected. If this trial was what it took to earn respect among the Varans, then he would face it. And so, the first meeting between humans and the Varans ended not with peace talks, but with a challenge that none of the humans had seen coming. The night in the alien city was long and heavy. The two moons of Vara hung above the sky like silver shields, and Miran sat by the glowing fire pit in the human camp. His companions, 3 other envoys from Earth, whispered nervously about the coming trial. None of them had expected this. They had trained for diplomacy, for speeches, for sharing knowledge, but not for contests under alien traditions. Miran looked at the fire and tried to keep calm. He had grown up in the mountains of Earth, where he had learned endurance from long climbs and cold winds. He was not the strongest of men, nor the fastest, but he knew patience and stubbornness. Those qualities had brought him here as a representative of humanity. Now, he wondered if they would be enough to carry him through a trial he did not understand. In the great hall nearby, Zira spoke with the elders of her people. She had not expected to be challenged, least of all by a human who looked smaller and lighter than any warrior she knew. Yet tradition demanded she face him. She felt a strange mix of pride and unease. Pride, because she was the guardian chosen to uphold the ways of her people. Unease, because the human's bow and mistake had not been born of arrogance. She could tell he had not meant to insult her. Still, once a trial was called, it could not be undone. The elders reminded her of the rules. The trial is not to destroy, one said. It is to test endurance, balance, and strength. The challenger must prove he can walk the path of the guardians. Zira nodded. She knew the trial well. It was a maze built in the ancient cliffs, where the gravity shifted strangely because of the planet's core. Stones had to be carried from one side to another while moving through the twisting paths. Many had failed, even among her own kind. For her people, it was a way to prove one's worth. For a human, it might be impossible. By morning, the trial grounds were prepared. The humans walked with wide eyes, studying the cliffs and glowing symbols carved into the stone. The air was thick, and the pull of the planet's gravity pressed hard on their bodies. They were visitors here, and every step felt heavier than on Earth. Miran followed the Varan guides up the rocky steps. His breath came slow, each inhale like lifting a weight. He looked at Zira, who climbed easily ahead of him. She moved with strength, her large frame built for this environment. Yet she kept glancing back at him, as though checking to see if he would falter before they even began. When they reached the top, the crowd gathered. Hundreds of Varans stood in a circle around the trial grounds. Their voices rumbled like distant thunder as they spoke among themselves. Many doubted the human would last. Some thought he would give up before the first turn of the maze. Others, more curious, wondered if perhaps humans had some hidden skill. The elder raised his staff and the crowd fell silent. The guardian Zira and the human Miran will face the trial of endurance. They will enter the maze and carry the sacred stones to the other side. Only when the stones are placed upon the altar will the trial be complete. Both may succeed, or both may fail. But no one may turn back. Miran nodded. His heart was steady, though his legs felt heavy under the alien gravity. He reminded himself that this was not about fighting. It was about showing respect, proving humanity's spirit. He tightened the straps of the pack he would use to carry the stones. Zero bent down and lifted her first stone. It was heavy, even for her, but she held it against her chest. Miran stepped forward to lift his. The moment his hands touched the stone, his arms trembled. It felt as if the weight of a mountain pressed against him. The crowd murmured, some laughing softly. Yet Miran did not stop. He pulled with steady force, lifted the stone onto his pack, and stood upright. The elder gave the signal, and the trial began. They entered the maze. The paths twisted between jagged walls of stone. The ground shifted strangely, as if gravity pulled in different directions with every few steps. Sometimes it felt like walking uphill, sometimes downhill, and sometimes sideways, even when the path was flat. Zero moved with practiced strength, but even she had to slow down in the twisting pull of the maze. Her legs were steady, her arms strong, but the shifting gravity tested even her balance. She glanced at Miran. To her surprise, he was still behind her, moving carefully, step by step. His body swayed, but he adjusted, using his hands to steady himself against the stone walls. He could not match her strength, but his patience was clear. Each step was deliberate, each breath steady. The crowd above watched closely, whispers rolling like wind through the cliffs. By the end of the first passage, sweat poured down Miran's face. His shoulders ached from the weight. Still, he did not stop. Zira growled softly, both in frustration at the challenge and in grudging respect for the human who refused to yield. The maze stretched ahead, long and merciless. This was only the beginning, yet already it was clear, the human might not be as weak as the Varans believed. The air inside the maze was thick and heavy. The walls rose high on both sides, glowing faintly with the light of minerals that shimmered like stars trapped in stone. Every turn felt the same, yet the pull of gravity shifted with each step, tilting the ground beneath their feet. Miran pressed forward, the sacred stone heavy on his back, while Zira strode ahead with strong but steady movements. The first stretch tested balance. At one turn the floor tilted sharply to the left, making the stone on Miran's back drag him sideways. His arms shot out to press against the walls, keeping him upright. His legs shook under the weight, but he took slow steps, careful not to slip. The crowd above, watching from ledges carved into the cliffs, murmured loudly. To them it seemed impossible that such a smaller being could still be standing. Zira glanced back once, expecting to see the human fallen. Instead, she saw him gripping the wall and moving forward with stubborn focus. He was slower than her, but he had not given up. For a moment, she felt a flicker of respect, though she quickly pushed it aside. The trial was not yet close to its hardest part. The path turned into an upward climb. The stones on their backs felt twice as heavy with each step. Zira's muscles flexed under the strain, her breath loud but steady. She had carried heavier loads before, though never for this distance. Miran followed, his knees burning, his shoulders screaming with pain. The straps of his pack cut into his skin, but he kept moving, planting one foot, then the other. At the top of the slope, Zira placed her hand on the stone wall and paused for a moment. She turned to see Miran reaching the top, his chest heaving. Sweat covered his face, and his legs trembled. He looked ready to collapse, yet his eyes still burned with determination. He gave a small nod as if to say he was not done yet. The crowd above began to shift in tone. Their murmurs carried less laughter and more curiosity. Some pointed at Miran with surprise, others whispered in disbelief. To them, humans had been seen as fragile outsiders. Yet here was one carrying a guardian's burden, refusing to stop. The next section of the maze twisted downward, and the gravity pulled harder. The stones on their backs seemed to double in weight, pressing their bodies into the ground. Zira growled softly as her knees bent under the force. She forced her body forward, step by step. Her people expected her to dominate this trial, but even she felt the drag of the shifting pull. Behind her, Miran staggered. The stone nearly pulled him to his knees, but he clenched his teeth and pushed forward. Each step left deep marks in the dust beneath his boots. His breaths came sharp and fast, but his rhythm stayed steady. He had climbed mountains on earth, carrying packs filled with gear through snow and storm. He remembered those days, the long hours where only persistence mattered. He used that memory now, placing one foot forward when everything in his body begged him to stop. Halfway through the downward passage, Zira's strength began to falter. Her powerful muscles were built for bursts of force, not long trials of endurance. Her breath grew heavier, her arms stiff from holding the stone. She slowed, her steps less steady than before. For the first time, Miran began to close the distance between them. The crowd above noticed. A ripple of voices echoed through the cliffs. The human was catching up. Zira clenched her jaw, unwilling to show weakness. She pushed harder, her body straining. At the end of the passage, both reached a wide platform where the gravity shifted again, this time making them feel strangely light. The stones on their backs pulled less, but their muscles ached from the sudden change. Zira stumbled forward, nearly dropping her stone. Miran saw her falter and steadied himself against the wall before moving closer. He did not speak, but his eyes followed her carefully. The trial continued through another twisting corridor where the ground shook beneath their feet. Dust fell from the walls, and the stones threatened to slip from their grips. Zira growled again, forcing herself to stand tall. She had trained for this her whole life, yet her arms trembled. Miran moved slower, but his steps were deliberate. He shifted the stone carefully, adjusting its weight on his back so it did not slip. The patience of his movements kept him from wasting energy. While Zira forced her way forward with bursts of strength, Miran conserved his. By the time they reached the second checkpoint, Zira was breathing heavily. Her chest rose and fell like a drum beat, her face flushed. She placed her stone down on the marker, her hands shaking for a moment before she lifted it again. Miran arrived just after her, his body bent under the weight but still standing. He set his stone on the marker too, pausing to wipe the sweat from his brow. The elder's voice carried from above. Both still stand. Both carry the burden. The trial continues. The crowd roared with approval, though many of them were now louder for the human than for their own guardian. The sight of his endurance had stirred something unexpected in them. Zira heard the cheers and felt a strange mix of emotions. She had expected to outpace him easily, yet he was still beside her. Worse, she could feel her own energy burning faster than his. Her pride bristled, but deep down, she began to realize that the human was not weak. He was different. His strength was not in raw power but in the will to keep going when others would stop. The trial was far from over, but already the balance had shifted. The human had shown he could endure, and the guardian of Vero was beginning to struggle. The maze grew darker as the sun shifted high above the cliffs. The glowing minerals in the stone walls lit the path faintly, but the air inside felt heavier with each step. The gravity shifted again, pressing hard on their bodies. The sacred stones on their backs seemed heavier than mountains. Zira forced her legs to move, her muscles burning. She had always been the strongest of her people, trained since youth to carry armor and weapons across the highlands of Vera. But this trial was longer than any she had faced in years. Sweat rolled down her arms, and her breathing grew loud. She glanced at Miran, who walked behind her, still carrying his stone with slow but steady steps. The human's face was pale, his body trembling, but his eyes stayed sharp. He moved like a man who had nothing else in the world except the will to place one foot after another. Zira felt a flicker of frustration. Why did he not collapse already? The trial was designed to test the strongest, and yet this smaller being carried on as though endurance alone was his shield. The path twisted upward again. Each step felt like climbing a hill with iron chains tied to their backs. Zira's pace slowed. Her legs ached, her arms shook, and she leaned against the wall for support. A growl slipped from her throat, low and frustrated. For the first time, she feared she might stumble before the human did. Miran saw her falter. His own body was screaming with pain, but when he saw her hand trembling on the stone wall, he quickened his steps. His boots dragged, but he moved forward until he was beside her. She looked at him with narrowed eyes, expecting him to pass her. Instead, he paused. "Steady," he said softly, letting the translator carry his words. His voice was calm, not mocking, not proud, just steady. He shifted his own weight and pressed one hand against her stone, helping her balance for a moment. The crowd above gasped. To them, the trial was a contest, a test of strength and will. No one had ever thought to help a rival. Yet here was the human, offering support to their guardian. Zira's pride flared. She wanted to push him away, to prove she needed no help. But her body betrayed her, trembling under the weight. She let his hand steady the stone just long enough to regain her footing. Her cheeks flushed, a warm color spreading across her face. She growled under her breath, not in anger but in embarrassment. The translators flickered, trying to catch her words. The voice that came through made the crowd erupt in murmurs. "I cannot walk straight after what you did." The words spread like fire through the ledges above. Some Varans laughed, others whispered in confusion. Miran blinked, not understanding what the translator meant. To him, she had simply growled in her own language. But to the audience, the phrase sounded strange and full of meaning. Zira straightened quickly, lifting her stone again without his support. Her jaw tightened, and she stepped forward, forcing herself to move faster. She would not let the crowd think she was weak. Miran followed, his body screaming with exhaustion, but his mind steady. He had not meant to cause a scene. He had only seen someone struggling and chosen to help. That was what humans did. On Earth, survival had often meant cooperation. To him, it was natural. To the Varans, it was new. As they pushed forward, the path narrowed into a tunnel. The ceiling pressed low, and the ground tilted sharply. Each step threatened to send them falling. Zira's legs shook, her breath heavy. Miran's pace slowed too, but he used his hands to steady himself against the walls, adjusting the weight of his stone with careful movements. The crowd above grew louder. Whispers turned into cheers, some for Zira, but many now for Miran. The human's endurance and his act of compassion had surprised them. What they had seen as weakness now looked like a different kind of strength. At the end of the tunnel, both reached another marker. Zira dropped her stone onto the platform with a loud thud, her chest rising and falling like a hammer striking steel. She looked down, ashamed that her body felt weaker than it should. Miran arrived seconds later, lowering his stone carefully. He almost collapsed beside it, but he caught himself, kneeling only for a moment before standing again. The elder's voice rang out across the cliffs. The human shows more than strength. He shows spirit. He shows a heart that carries others as well as himself. The crowd roared, their voices echoing through the maze. Zira stood still, her fists clenched. She had never been compared to another in this way. She had always been the strongest, the most reliable. Yet here was a human, smaller and weaker, who had carried his burden and even supported her when she faltered. Miran looked at her, his expression calm despite his exhaustion. He gave a simple nod, as if to say they were both still in this together. For the first time, Zira felt something she had never felt in a trial before. It was not anger, not rivalry. It was respect. And though she would not admit it yet, she also felt relief that she was not walking the path alone. The trial was not over. The hardest part still waited ahead. But the moment of weakness had already changed everything. The human had shown the Varans that strength was more than muscle. It was also the will to carry another when they stumble. The maze grew wider as the two challengers reached its middle point. Here the paths twisted into open chambers where the air shifted strangely, pulling them down one moment and lifting them up the next. The sacred stones felt heavier and lighter in turns, confusing the body and draining its strength. Zira pushed forward, her body tense with effort. She had always believed herself unshakable, the strongest warrior of her people, but the trial was grinding her endurance away. Every step felt heavier, every breath sharper. She had nearly stumbled before, and the memory of the human's steadying hand still burned in her mind. The words she had growled in frustration had returned through the translator in a strange phrase that echoed through the audience above, "I cannot walk straight after what you did." The moment had caused laughter, surprise, and endless whispers. Some Varans still chuckled as they watched her now, their guardian who had never once been mocked in trial before. Zira's cheeks burned with heat. To her people, blushing was rare and obvious, a sign of embarrassment or emotion. She hated that it showed now, hated that her weakness had been made public. But worse, she hated that it was tied to the human beside her. Miran, however, did not understand what the phrase had meant. He had only seen her stumble and had acted to help. Now he walked behind her again, his stone pressing heavily into his back, his legs nearly buckling with each shift in gravity. Yet his face remained calm, his eyes forward, his movements patient. He gave no sign of shame or pride, only quiet determination. The crowd followed every step. Some jeered, still unwilling to accept that a human could endure what their own kind struggled with. Others cheered for him, fascinated by his stubborn strength. For generations, the Varans had believed power meant dominance, that strength was measured only in muscle and force. Yet here was a human proving that another kind of strength existed, one they had not respected before. The next chamber of the maze tested balance above all. The path narrowed to a bridge of stone stretched across a pit where the pull of gravity shifted violently. Each step could drag them sideways or upward, threatening to send them crashing down. Zira stepped onto the bridge first. Her strong legs bent low, her arms wide for balance. The sacred stone weighed her down, pulling her toward the edge, but she gritted her teeth and pressed on. Miran followed. His movements were slower, more deliberate. He bent his knees and spread his arms, shifting the weight of his stone carefully with every step. The bridge swayed under them, but he stayed steady. Halfway across, Zero faltered again. A sudden pull from the side dragged her off balance, and she stumbled dangerously close to the edge. The stone on her back shifted, threatening to slip. She growled in frustration, her body shaking. Miran reacted without thinking. He took a step forward, steadying his own load, and reached out with one hand. His palm pressed against the edge of her stone, keeping it from sliding off. With his support, she regained her balance and pushed forward to safety. The audience erupted. Some roared in disapproval, others in astonishment. The translators again carried her frustrated growl into the same awkward phrase. "I cannot walk straight after what you did." This time the crowd laughed louder, though not in cruelty. There was excitement in their voices, a thrill at the unusual bond forming before their eyes. To them, it was unheard of, a challenger helping a guardian in trial, and a guardian blushing in response. Zira's face flushed hotter than before. She felt her pride tearing in two directions. Part of her wanted to deny it, to prove she needed no help. But another part, deep inside, could not ignore the truth. Without the human's steadying hand, she might have fallen. When they reached the end of the bridge, both set their stones down on the marker. Zira stood tall, her chest rising and falling, her fists clenched at her sides. Miran bent forward, gasping for breath, sweat dripping from his chin. Yet when he looked up, his eyes were calm again. He gave her a simple nod, as though nothing unusual had happened. That nod unsettled her more than the stumble itself. He did not see himself as superior for helping her. He did not mock her or boast. He treated it as natural, as though helping was as important as surviving. The elder's voice rose above the noise of the crowd. What we see today is not only the weight of stone. We see the weight of spirit. The human carries his own burden and reaches to steady another. This is not weakness. This is strength of a different kind. The crowd's cheers swelled. Many of the younger warriors shouted in support of Miran. Some of the older ones frowned, uncertain, yet even they could not deny what they had seen. Zero lowered her eyes for a moment, her blush still warm. She felt something she had never felt in trial before, respect for another challenger. She had fought side by side with her people, but never had someone placed her balance above their own. Miran lifted his stone again and prepared for the next path. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his spirit seemed unbroken. Zira followed, her pride still wounded but her heart beginning to change. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps strength was not only about power. Perhaps it was also about the courage to carry another when they falter. The trial was not yet over, but the meaning of it had already begun to shift. The trial pressed onward into its deepest section. The path turned narrow again, winding between sharp cliffs where the ground shifted like waves under their feet. Each step felt different, as though the very planet tested them with invisible hands. Zira's muscles burned with fire. Her arms trembled, her legs ached, and every breath scraped like iron in her chest. She had carried heavy weights many times before, yet she had never felt this close to collapse. Her pride told her to push forward alone, to prove her strength, but her body no longer listened. Behind her, Miran struggled too. The sacred stone bent his back, his shoulders shook, and sweat dripped into his eyes. But his movements stayed steady, each step taken with care. He did not rush. He did not fight against the shifting pull of the ground. He flowed with it, finding his rhythm. It was not the strength of force but the strength of patience. The crowd above had grown restless with excitement. At first, they had cheered for Zira alone. Now, half the voices called for the human. His determination, his refusal to stop, had touched them in a way they had not expected. The Varans were a people who respected power above all, but here was a human showing them another form of power, one they could not deny. The next chamber was the harshest yet. The walls opened into a wide circle where the pull of gravity shifted wildly. At the center was a raised altar of stone, glowing faintly with the light of ancient carvings. This was where the stones had to be placed to complete the trial. Zira stepped onto the shifting ground first. The weight of her stone dragged her sharply to one side, and she staggered, barely holding on. She gritted her teeth, forcing her legs forward, but the strength in her body was nearly gone. Her vision blurred, her steps uneven. Miran entered behind her. The pull nearly sent him to his knees, but he spread his arms, leaning into the tilt. His stone slid dangerously on his back, but he adjusted the straps and kept moving. His breath was ragged, but his eyes stayed fixed on the glowing altar. Halfway across, Zira's legs gave way. She fell to one knee, the stone pressing down with crushing force. A deep growl left her throat, filled with anger and shame. She tried to stand, but her body refused. The crowd gasped, their guardian fallen. Miran saw her collapse. His own body begged him to keep going, to drop his stone on the altar and end the trial, but he did not. Instead, he stopped, turned, and walked back toward her. Every step burned, every breath felt like fire, but he pressed on until he stood beside her. He placed one hand under her arm, steadying her, and shifted his body so that part of the weight of her stone leaned onto his shoulder. His knees almost buckled, but he braced himself and pulled her to her feet. Zira stared at him, stunned. Why, she managed to whisper, her voice rough. Miran met her eyes. Because strength is not only for yourself, he said simply. The translator carried his words across the chamber. The crowd above fell silent. For a moment, all that could be heard was the sound of their labored breaths. Zira's face burned with heat again, but this time it was not only from shame. It was from something deeper, something she had never felt in a trial before. She had been taught that strength was pride, that strength was victory, but this human had shown her another meaning. Together, they moved toward the altar. Miran's steps dragged, his legs trembling, but he refused to let go. Zira leaned against him, her own pride crumbling with every step, yet her respect for him growing stronger. When they reached the altar, Zira placed her stone down first, her hands shaking. Miran followed, setting his stone beside hers. The two weights landed together with a heavy sound that echoed through the chamber. The elder raised his staff high, his voice carrying across the cliffs. The trial is complete. The crowd erupted. Some roared for Zira, others for Miran, but many cheered for both. What they had witnessed was not a contest of strength alone but a lesson their people had never considered. Zira stood tall, though her body was still weak. She turned to Miran, her eyes sharp but softer than before. "You should not have helped me," she said quietly. "This was my burden." Miran shook his head. "On Earth, we carry each other. That is how we survive." The words struck her deeply. She had never imagined survival as a shared task. Her people believed each warrior stood alone, proving their worth in solitude. Yet here was proof that another path existed, one where strength was measured not by how much you carried alone but by how much you could lift together. The elder spoke again, his voice filled with gravity. The human has shown us a strength that is not muscle, not pride, but something greater. This lesson is one we must not ignore. The cheers rose louder, filling the air with thunder. Zero looked at Miran one last time, her face still flushed. For the first time in her life, she bowed her head slightly in respect. Miran, exhausted and near collapse, only gave her a small nod. To him, it was not victory. It was simply the right thing to do. The trial had ended, but its meaning would echo far beyond the maze. The Varans had seen a new kind of strength, and the human envoy had changed their understanding forever. The trial was over, but the story of that day had only begun. The chamber grew quiet again as the elder lowered his staff. His voice carried across the cliffs with a weight greater than stone. Let all remember this moment. The human has walked among us and shown a truth hidden from our pride. Strength is not only in the arm. Strength lives also in the heart that chooses to share. The words sank into every ear, and even the proudest warriors could not deny them. For generations the Varans had believed that glory came only through standing alone. Now they had seen with their own eyes a rival who refused to win alone and still reached the altar with honor. Miran's body trembled with exhaustion, but he stood tall. His back ached, his arms felt heavy as iron, yet he carried himself with calm. He looked at the faces around him, and for the first time, he saw no anger or suspicion. Instead, he saw respect. Zira, though still weary, walked closer to him. Her steps were slow, but her eyes held a new light. "You have surprised me, human," she said. "I thought you weak when I first saw you. I thought you would fail within the first trial. But you showed me that my way was not the only way." Miran gave a tired smile. "And you showed me that your people's strength is real. Alone, I would not have reached the altar. Together, we did." The crowd above had no single voice. Some still cheered for Zira, proud of their guardian. Others shouted Miran's name, their respect for him growing with every breath. And many began chanting for both, their voices blending into one thunderous call that shook the stone walls. The elder raised his hands again, calling for silence. "The trial is complete, but the bond between our worlds must now be shaped. What path shall we take?" The council of elders stepped forward from their seats. They were old, wise, and slow to change. For a moment they whispered among themselves, their long cloaks brushing the stone floor. At last, one spoke aloud. "The human has passed not by crushing his rival but by lifting her. Perhaps we must lift too. Perhaps our world must no longer stand alone." Gasps filled the air. The idea was bold. To ally with an off-world species was something the Varans had never done. Yet the weight of the moment was undeniable. Zira crossed her arms, her face still warm with pride but softened by the memory of Miran's hand steadying her. "If he had left me behind, I would have fallen. My people would have cheered my defeat, and I would have carried shame forever. Instead, he carried me, though he could have claimed victory alone. For this, I will honor him." Her words struck the crowd deeply. If their strongest guardian accepted this truth, who could deny it? The elder turned to Miran. "Human, what do you ask of us?" Miran paused, then spoke with care. "I ask for friendship. I ask that your people and mine learn from each other. We are not the same, but we both have strengths. Together, we can be greater than alone." The translator carried his words, and the silence that followed felt heavy. Then, slowly, The elder bowed his head. So it shall be. Today, our people take a new path. The crowd erupted again, this time with joy rather than prideful challenge. Warriors who had once glared now clapped their hands to their chests in salute. The sound rolled across the cliffs like thunder, and for the first time in their history, the Varans cheered not only for themselves but for someone from another world. Zira stepped closer to Miran, her expression unreadable. Then, in a rare gesture, she placed her hand over her chest and bowed her head. You carry a strange strength, human. It unsettles me, but I respect it. Miran nodded, his lips curving into a quiet smile. And you carry a strength that humbles me. I will not forget this day. As the trial ended, the two walked side by side out of the chamber. The weight of stone was gone, but the memory of carrying each other remained. Outside, the light of the twin suns painted the sky with gold and crimson. The air felt lighter, the world quieter, as though even the planet itself waited to see what would come next. A group of young Varans ran to the path, eyes wide with excitement. One shouted, "Human, show us how you walk the earth way." Another added, "Teach us to carry together." Their voices were not mocking but filled with eagerness. Miran laughed softly, surprised by their innocence. "I will teach, if you will teach me in return," he said. Zira raised an eyebrow at his words but could not hide the faint curve at the edge of her mouth. She had not laughed in many years, yet somehow the human spirit stirred something in her that she could not explain. The elders watched from above as the two walked forward, side by side, surrounded by cheers. What had begun as a test of strength had ended as the first step of an alliance. For the Varans, the day would be remembered in song and stone. For humanity, it would be written as a chapter of hope. And for Zira and Miran, it was the start of a story greater than either could have imagined. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges yet unseen. But together, they had already proven one truth: strength shared was strength multiplied. And that truth would guide them both into whatever future awaited beyond the stars.